For over 2,000 years, certain biblical verses, written by men, edited by institutions, and stamped with divine authority, have been used not to liberate humanity, but to discipline it, not to unite humanity, but to divide it. And nowhere is that manipulation more visible or more devastating than in the way Scripture was repurposed to rationalize racial hierarchy, enslavement, and mass violence. Consider Genesis chapter 4, verses 10 through 15, the story of Cain and Abel. After Cain murders his brother, God declares, "Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Cain is cursed, marked, and condemned to wander. Over time, this passage, never once mentioning skin color, was rebranded by theologians into what became known as the curse of Cain. That mark, white Christian interpreters later claimed, was black skin. And not because the text says so either, but because power required a divinely sanctioned justification for the enslavement, dehumanization, and mass violence it was inflicting primarily upon black people and ultimately upon people of color more broadly. Then there's Genesis chapter 9, verses 22 through 27, the so-called curse of Ham. After Noah awakens from his drunkenness, he condemns Canaan, declaring that he and his descendants shall be servants of servants. Again, the text never identifies Africans. It never mentions race. Yet this passage was deliberately reinterpreted by white European theologians to suggest that African people were divinely assigned to servitude. These interpretations were not accidental. They were strategic. By the time European empires were expanding across the globe, this theological fiction had become a moral infrastructure, one capable of convincing ordinary Christians that the oppression of black people was acceptable because it was God's will. The New Testament was then used to reinforce obedience to that system. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9, enslaved people are commanded to obey their earthly masters with fear and trembling, as though serving Christ himself. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 24, they are told to obey in everything, not merely to avoid punishment, but as an act of reverence toward God. And in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, enslaved people are instructed to submit not only to kind masters, but to cruel ones, and to endure unjust suffering as something commendable before God. These verses did not merely sit on the page. They governed plantations, they shaped sermons, they informed laws. And belief, when expressed through policy, is no longer symbolic, it's operational. This is how an entire race of white Christian believers, Catholic, Protestant, Evangelical, Presbyterian, Baptist, became desensitized to human suffering. Not because they lacked morality, but because morality itself had been redefined for them through scriptures, a theological fraud, so effective that it allowed centuries of enslavement, racial terror, and systemic dehumanization to be tolerated and even celebrated under the guise of divine order. And the proof of belief is not found in prayer, it's found in patterns. When generations of white Americans repeatedly supported laws, institutions, and politicians that upheld slavery, segregation, racialized policing, mass incarceration, and economic exclusion, while invoking God, Scripture, and Christian values, that support functioned as evidence of belief in such interpretations. Not belief as abstract faith, but belief as political allegiance. This same weaponized theology fueled European campaigns of conquest under banners such as the Crusades, 1095 to 1291, the Spanish Inquisition, 1478 to 1834, and Manifest Destiny, 1607 to 1890. Armed with the Bible, the King James Bible, the Geneva Bible, European crusaders, inquisitors, and settlers claimed divine entitlement to indigenous land, resources, and lives. Entire civilizations were erased with Scripture in hand. Hence, such violence expanded well beyond the Americas, for it originally reached deep into Africa, where millions of black men, women, and children were kidnapped, shackled, and trafficked across the Atlantic in one of the greatest crimes against humanity, the transatlantic slave trade. This was not chaos, it was theology turned into policy, Scripture turned into law, faith turned into a weapon. When Sinclair Lewis wrote in 1935 that fascism in America would arrive wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross, he wasn't predicting the future, he was exposing the playbook. Nearly a century later, that same script is still being followed almost word for word. White nationalism did not disappear. It rebranded. It cloaked itself in patriotism. It learned to speak the language of democracy while hollowing it out from within. And at the center of that transformation sits the longest-running psychological weapon in Western history. The weaponization of Christianity, the velvet glove covering the iron fist of oppression. For Black people, this is not abstract history. It is their lived reality. Christianity did not arrive peacefully. It arrived on ships with chains. It marched through lands with crusader swords. It signed its sermons in blood across continents. From Manifest Destiny to the transatlantic slave trade, from Jim Crow to colonial Africa, from indigenous reservations to modern prisons, the cross has too often functioned less as a symbol of salvation and more as a banner of domination. What Lewis observed in 1935 was simply the continuation of over a millennia-long pattern.
Religion fused with power, mobilized to control bodies, silence voices, and sanctify inequality.
That fusion isn't just ancient history either. It's also present tense. In our current political moment, Republican operatives recycle the same theological machinery with updated language. Exclusionary policies are wrapped in family values. Voter suppression is disguised as election integrity. God's name is invoked as cover for greed, cruelty, and authoritarian control. This isn't faith, it's strategy. It isn't salvation, it's subjugation. And we now have rare documented proof of what that strategy looks like behind closed doors. On October 14, 2025, a Politico investigation published roughly 2,900 pages of leaked private chat logs, primarily from Discord servers and group messages, connected to young, rising figures inside the Republican Party infrastructure. These were not anonymous trolls. These were state vice chairs, national committee members, party lawyers, political operatives, individuals positioned as the future leadership class of the Republican Party. What the leak exposed was chilling. Not just isolated slurs, but patterns. Open glorification of slavery, framed as edgy humor. Fantasies about gas chambers and mass death. Casual everyday use of racial slurs. Anti-Semitic conspiracy rhetoric and Holocaust minimization. Violent civil war and ethnic cleansing fantasies. Systematic dehumanization of marginalized groups disguised as policy discussion. What made this scandal alarming wasn't shock value, it was normalization. The tone of the messages suggested this language was routine, reinforced as it proceeded to escalate. This was not extremism at the fringe, it was culture forming inside institutions. Publicly, many of these individuals presented themselves as respectable conservatives, free speech advocates, anti-racism skeptics. Privately, they spoke in a language that closely mirrors early-stage authoritarian movements throughout history. And history shows us something crucial. Mass violence does not begin with action, it begins with language. When you see repetition, group reinforcement, and operational overlap, when the same people joking about genocide are also discussing campaigns, legal strategy, and party leadership, you are not witnessing humor. You are witnessing an identity system. Authoritarian movements follow recognizable stages. First comes transgression bonding, breaking social taboos together to establish in-group trust. Then casual dehumanization, people reduced to vermin, invaders, parasites. Then moral inversion, where cruelty is reframed as virtue, self-defense, protecting children, God's law. Then the aestheticization of domination, fantasies about camps, executions, cleansing. And finally, institutional capture, when people holding these norms gain legal authority, policy influence, and enforcement power. At every stage, plausible deniability is weaponized. It was just a joke. You took it out of context. That was satire.
This dual language system, signal to insiders, denial to outsiders, is not accidental. It is a survival tactic perfected by authoritarian movements from Nazi Germany to the Ku Klux Klan to fascist Italy.
And here is the most dangerous warning sign of all. The greatest historical danger doesn't appear when violence begins. It appears when educated institutional actors normalize the language. That is why leaks involving party vice chairs, legal counsel, and national committee members are not scandals to shrug off. They are historical red alerts. This is where Christian nationalism intersects seamlessly with authoritarianism.
Both rely on hierarchy framed as divine. Both require enemies. Both justify harm as righteousness.
When political power adopts religious certainty, cruelty gains urgency in their believers' minds. Apocalyptic thinking turns compromise into betrayal and oppression into necessary action. That is how voter suppression becomes order. That is how stripped rights become morality. That is how authoritarianism becomes administrative. And once you see the design, you can never unsee it. Once the flag and the cross are stripped away, what remains is not faith at all. It is power clinging desperately to its throne. That last point paves the way to a profound quote by none other than Mother Teresa, which reads as follows: "If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other." End quote. The final and most dangerous illusion that racism depends on is the belief that it is simple. It is not. Racist people, and more importantly, racist institutions and think tanks, are often highly intelligent, highly strategic, and deeply aware of the tools they use. They understand psychology, they understand narrative, they understand how to dress cruelty in language that feels rational, moral, even sacred. That is why vigilance matters so much. Racism rarely survives on hatred alone. It survives through design.
It borrows scripture. It borrows science. It borrows patriotism. It borrows fear.
And then it repackages domination as order, exclusion as values, and hierarchy as God's will. That's why just knowing the truth is not enough. We must remain attentive to how deception evolves. Because the deeper truth, the one buried beneath manipulated Bible verses, racial myths, and political theater, is not complex at all. It pertains to simply understanding that we are one human family. The powers of this world thrive on division. They feed us narratives engineered to fracture us by race, politics, and creed. But the truth they fear is far simpler than the systems they build to hide it. We are all God's chosen people. We're here, aren't we? And existence itself is the only qualification that has ever mattered.
Nature has been teaching us this lesson forever.
Look at a garden: hibiscus, tulips, roses, different shapes, different colors, different fragrances. None competing for worth, none ranked by divine preference. Together they create beauty, not despite their differences, but because of them. Humanity was crafted the same way. Some of us are lighter, some darker, some tall, some short. Our hair grows thick or fine. Our gifts stretch across intellect, artistry, strength, and innovation. Some talents are inherited, others are earned. But every one of us entered this world through a woman's womb. Every one of us bleeds the same color. Every one of us requires air, water, and food to live. And one day, every soul leaves this physical state of existence and returns to whatever lies beyond it. That shared reality outweighs every manufactured division ever imposed upon us. To claim that one race, one ethnicity, or one group alone is chosen is not only false, it is a distortion of creation itself, a distortion introduced by racially supremacist, narcissistic, chauvinistic men seeking power, and certainly not by God's design. The Creator did not choose some of us. The Creator chose all of us, past, present, and future, because we were all meant to be here. Once you understand that, truly understand it, no scriptural verse can be twisted to make you hate your brother of humanity. No religious doctrine can convince you to oppress your sister of humanity. And no ideology built on hierarchy will be able to survive your awareness. The sooner we recognize this truth, the sooner humanity can stop fighting against itself and begin thriving together. The garden was never meant to be uniform. It was meant to be radiant in its diversity.
Different flowers, one garden.
Different people, one family.
All chosen.
Welcome to Truths for the Soul, where wisdom is universal, truth is for everyone, and awakening is the purpose.